Everyone, it's Stephanie with the Patient Story, and I hope you're doing well wherever you're joining us from. I'm really excited to introduce our guest today. Jason, welcome. I'm really excited to share your story.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, and I know we have a lot to talk about. You were diagnosed with mantle cell lymphoma stage 4 at a very young age. And so much to get through in that. But before we start, I love to ask people to describe themselves outside of the cancer context, because as we know, we're so much more than our diagnosis. So tell us about yourself.
Sure. Well, I'm in New York City, and pre-cancer diagnosis, I was an entrepreneur. I guess I still am, and I have a small business. I'm a tennis player, a theater goer. I like to travel, I like to gamble. I go to Las Vegas pretty regularly. But yeah, I say, I'm most passionate about my business, which is a production supply and walkie-talkie production services company in New York City in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, which is a great neighborhood in New York City. So I've been in, video production services for over 20 years. And in 2017, I started my own company after being a freelancer for, many years. And that was actually kind of a magical experience, because if I didn't start a company, I don't know how I would have, fared this storm, because if I was still in the freelance world, producing shoots or working for somebody 40 hours a week, I think that I would have some pretty significant challenges dealing with the cancer diagnosis and the treatment and the ongoing treatment. So yeah, being an entrepreneur has been very lucky and fortunate for me.
I know that for you, it was really a little over 2 years ago when you started the first symptoms or started feeling them. Describe what you were feeling. And I know it went on for a while before you got resolution, but what did you do? When did you first go to the doctor?
Yeah, uh, it was about 2.5 years ago. It was the summer of 2019. And the very first symptom was on my arms. I was getting like a rash. It was very red and bumpy and itchy. And it started on my arms, on the forearms. And I really didn't think much of it for like the first 2 or 3 weeks. I really didn't think much of it at all. And I was out to dinner with a very close friend of mine, Adrian, who happens to be a doctor himself. He's a hospitalist at Well Cornell, and he's a really great doctor and a really great friend of mine. And we were meeting up for dinner, and he said, "What's on your arms?" And I said, "I don't know." And he's like, "You should have it looked at." And I said, I don't think it's anything to worry about." So another couple of weeks went by, and it was still there. And his comment was sort of in my head. So I made an appointment with my primary care physician, and I got in. So that, has been about another, I'm probably going 5 weeks after the first sort of sign. So I go into the primary care office, and at this point, there's hives other places than my forearms. And the primary care physician says, "Yeah, it looks like hives to me. Hives are really common. We get a lot of people in here with hives, and we run all sorts of tests and are looking into it. And the majority of the time they kind of just go away, and we never really figured out what it was." We talked a lot about, like, did you change your detergent? Did you change your soap? And then he took a lot of blood and ran my blood work. He's a wonderful doctor. I love my primary care doctor. I still have him today. And he called, like, the next day. I was like, "We got your blood results back. Everything looks perfect. Hopefully this just goes away." And so I was like, "Oh, great. Blood work came back great. Hopefully this will just go away." So time went by, and it started getting worse. It started spreading to other parts of my body. It started becoming more itchy, more inflamed. It went from, just being on my forearms to being all over my chest and all over my stomach and down my thighs. And, it just sort of progressed. So I went back to see him again. And he said, I'm not quite sure with your blood work being right, what it could be. Why don't we look into going to like an allergist or immunologist, rheumatologist type person, and a dermatologist. So I went to somebody who had a specialty in all of those categories, allergy, immunologist, rheumatologist. And we ran blood work like I've never experienced. I mean, the amount of vials of blood that I gave and the amount of tests that I did over the course of, 2 months with this person was just over the top. And the bill was also over the top. And the only thing that came back was an elevated IgM. That was it. That was the only thing that came back irregular in my blood work. And the dermatologist initially was like, I don't think these are hives. I think it could be something else, and everybody thought it was hives, my primary care and thing. And he was like, there's a chance it could be this. It's a rare thing. And so he goes, let's biopsy, a few in a couple different places on your body. So he biopsied, I think 4 and sent them away. And it
And what
came
does that
back.
mean, Jason, when they biopsy just for the skin? Was it just like a little prick or?
It's like a punch biopsy, where they basically, think if you have like one hive that's sticking up, they just take the whole thing, and then send them to a lab. So they took 4, I think they took 2 on my back and 2 on my stomach or something like that. And those came back as urticaria and urticaria vasculitis. So that is hives. But the vasculitis meant there was hives not only on top of my skin, which are traditional hives, but also under in the derma. So I was getting hives, basically on both sides of my skin, on the exterior and the interior. And now we're like 4 and 5 months into this with me having hives, and they're just progressively getting worse and worse and worse. And there were some sleepless nights. There were definitely it was unbearable not to itch them. And then it would create scabbing and blood. And, my sheets were tinted with blood spots. And, it was painful. There was a few nights that, the pain level was an 8 or a 9, it was just like, looking back, I kind of can't believe I didn't just go into the emergency room. Like looking back and what I was doing and just like, laying in a bathtub and trying to like throw ice all over me and just doing all of these things to try and combat it. I should have just gone to the emergency room.
But it is, it's not a unique experience in that it's so easy for us to explain away things too, or just sort of like deal with in the moment. But for you, yeah, months of this to understand maybe now how high of a tolerance level you have for pain, and right, you learned a lot about yourself, I'm sure.
I did, yeah. And the dermatologist gave me steroid cream, which was helpful. And I put that all over, and it was really helpful. And as we were going through the diagnosis process, eventually I landed at a hematologist. Is where I landed, and the allergist immunologist was like, I have to send you to a hematologist because you have an elevated IgM, but there's nothing wrong with you. I assure you, your blood work looks so great. She goes, but we have to do it. It's called a rule out. So I go to the hematologist, and I'm there thinking like, okay, I'm here for a rule out. What's a rule out? I don't know what a rule out is, And I go into the office, and they put me in a room, and the PA, who is the PA, so that's the physician assistant to the hematologist that I have an appointment with, comes in and is very cheerful and says, we're doing a bone marrow biopsy today. And I was like, what is that? It's like, I'm going in there for a rule out. I don't even know what that word means. And then this like young girl comes in and tells me that we're doing a bone marrow biopsy. And I was like, and then she explains it to me, and I literally started crying. And I was like, what in the world is going on here? Like, like, so then the doctor came in, the hematologist, and I'm crying, and she's trying to talk me down. And I'm just like, look, you guys didn't tell me that this is what's happening. Like, I could have mentally prepared for this. I could have brought my friend, I am not doing this today, you
Yeah.
know?
Which, by the way, another great point, Jason, this is an example of you modeling the self-advocacy. You're like, look, you're telling me that I need to do this. I had no idea. I don't even know what this is. We're not doing it today. So you put your foot down. But before we move on, I think it's actually really important. If you had the chance to try and explain, maybe with like language centered on like emotions to really humanize what this means, but like to let doctors and medical staff and also just other people understand like what it feels like to be told all these things in jargon. You don't know what it is, but you're like, this is your life. And then to have this surprise thrust on you of a bone marrow biopsy, like, could you put into words what that felt like, the impact was?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, in that moment, I was the tears and the emotion that were happening in that room was like, I'm at a hematologist's office and this person thinks I have cancer because they want to do a bone marrow biopsy, and here it goes, here it begins, the torture, um, I had always said after witnessing my mom go through all that, that I would never do chemotherapy. After I saw that, I said, I'm never doing that. And, I haven't done traditional chemotherapy, and it was a big part of my decision making, to avoid it. And and that's probably historical,
Yeah. Yeah. And
so.
and it's what I think is so interesting, on top of everything that you've already said, is just why it's so important to understand someone's story, even between like a doctor and a patient, is to know where this is coming from. Like it was a really big impact on your decision making process. And
Mhm.
this is why it's important to treat the person. There's just so many factors to consider and understand. So Jason, thank you for sharing that. I know that you then were told to schedule the bone marrow biopsy for another day and also a PET CT scan. Um,
Mhm.
Sort of high level, briefly, like any guidance for people on the PET CT scan? I know it's something that happens multiple times if you have lymphoma.
So yeah, so they basically said, okay, when can you come back? And I said, I'll come back in 1 week. And they said, okay, well, we also want you to get a PET CT. And I'm going, okay, this is the rule out of, a PET CT and a bone marrow biopsy. So again, I don't know anything about a PET CT. I don't know what it is. Nobody tells me. And I go and I'm by myself. And then I go in this room, which I'm going to be isolated in. And there's a nurse, and he's very nice. And I'm asking a lot of questions. And he's got to put an IV in me. I've never had an IV before in my entire life. And he was asking me if I've ever had this done before. And I said, no. And then he starts explaining it and explaining, what he's going to inject in me. And I'm like, is that dangerous? This sounds dangerous. Is this okay? Like, is this bad for my health? And, he was kind of saying, well, it's not something you should do. Like, it's not, it is, radiation and radioactive material. But, he said, if your doctor has ordered this test, then it's probably really important that you do it. So he said that, and I said, okay, that makes sense. Like, if a doctor really wants me to do this, I should do it.
Right.
But that was another thing where I had no idea what it was going into it. There was a lot of that. Like the first time going to the doctor's office, the first time going to the infusion center, the first time getting a PET scan, the first time getting a bone marrow biopsy. It's really scary that first time. Like, the buildings look so different the first time I go from the second time I go. The first time I go, I just have this like scary memory of them, and then as I go back over and over again, it fades and they seem like normal places to me. but I can always remember the first time I go to a building and get that first thing I've never done before. It's just like a very sterile, scary kind of situation.
Yeah.
But it seems to fade away after you do it the first time.
Right. It gets a little more
You know,
familiar.
yeah.
To your point about how daunting it is, how would you describe in human terms, as we say, to other patients and caregivers, how would you describe in a human way what a PET CT scan is like?
Um, they set the IV and then they inject you with something which I still don't 100% understand. I've asked a lot of questions about it, but it's definitely like I get a piece of paper here in New York City that I have to carry around with me because they have monitors in the subways looking for dirty bombs, like radiation bombs. And if you get a PET CT, there's a chance you can set one of those off. So I get a piece of paper walking around New York City. They tell you don't hug children, for the first few hours when you're done with it, and drink a ton of water. But they set an IV and then they inject you with that material, which sets off those dirty bomb things in the subway station. And then you sit there for an hour in an isolated room. And from the looks of it, the room, is meant to like keep whatever you're radiating from your body from other people. Like it's a very lonely hour. You're not allowed to bring a friend because you're emitting something, and they kind of, when they're guiding you in, they almost like put some space in between them and you. It's nobody's getting close to you that during that process and for a little bit after. And then after the hour, they call you in. They also will have you drink, while you're waiting, like a substance. I can't remember what it is exactly. I think it starts with a G, but it's basically like sugar water. So you're getting the injection of something that's going into your veins that helps them see imaging of your organs and your lymph nodes, and then you're drinking something that's probably insulin or glucose type base that's going throughout your whole body, and that's sort of the magic for making the imaging. And so you do that for an hour. You sit there, you get injected, you drink all the juice, and then they bring you in and you go lay down on a long little table, and then they send you through a tube, and it takes about, for me, because I'm stage 4, so my lymph nodes are from my groin to here, there. So my scan probably takes longer than most people's, depending on the type of cancer you have. But for me, they start about at my thighs, and then they go up to about here, up to my ears. And it probably takes about 28 minutes to do that scan, and you just sit there and don't move for 28 minutes.
Right.
And then they let you go with your piece of paper to get out of jail if you set off a New York City MTA radiation monitor.
Okay. And then of course I do want to, remind people that there's always a wait time. Depends on when you get the PET CT scan. A lot of people would prefer that they just get the results right away, but then, radiologists have to read it or whatever. So there is a wait. And I'll ask you later about how you got through all those times with scanxiety. You've heard of that word, right?
I haven't heard that word, but I know what it means. Like,
Right.
sense.
Anxiety. And it's not just about scans. It's just that, waiting period essentially for any results or even before a procedure. I mean, I think it depends on whom you ask, but okay. And then the bone marrow biopsy, which I know is not fun. And I know you ended up having a pretty severe reaction in terms of back pain, but in terms of the actual procedure itself, if you were to like just elevator pitch it to someone like a few lines, how would you describe it to your friend? Or
I'm not a fan of bone marrow biopsies. I don't like them, and I will definitely be kicking and screaming if I have to ever do another one, and we'll need to work on some other ways of either medicating me more or, you know, making the experience better for me. Because you know, I'm sure people, I don't know if people know exactly what it is, but you know, they're essentially taking a very long, you know, needle and jamming it into your lower back and going straight into the bone to the core of it and removing some marrow. And then at the same time, going back in that same, you know, where they went in and taking what's called an aspiration, which is a small amount or, you know, a tiny piece of the bone as well. And sometimes they'll even go to two spots to get to marrow from two different spots. Um, so yeah, I mean, that like, you know, I can't imagine anybody would want to do that. I don't like the experience at all. I've tried, you know, I've done two of them. I've done, you know, the Ativan, the Razapam type stuff, and you know, it wasn't enough for me. You know, it was, you know, I always say I'm done collecting bad memories of bone marrow biopsies. So if, you know, they want to do another one, we're going to have to work something out, because I don't want to do it under the circumstances I've done the last two.
Yeah, and that's another great example of you advocating for what you believe is best for you. I do want to get to the actual clinical trial. So, as we wrap this part of it, I know that you ended up, well, first of all, you did lose weight. You said about 20 pounds in like just a few months, right?
Yeah.
Which is another big red flag. What did the oncologist, the lymphoma specialist, tell you about that?
So, you know, you talked about this anxiety. I had a long wait to get into, actually meet my, you know, oncologist who I have now, because the hematologist who did the bone marrow biopsy, that first one, who was doing the rule out with the PET scan, you know, she had sent my bone marrow out to lab, to see, you know, what it was. But before it went out, she said she took a smear of it and put it on a slide and looked at it under a microscope. And she said, I can tell for sure you have a B cell cancer just by looking at it. I can tell. She goes, I'm a myeloma doctor. I'm referring you to the lymphoma center. The bone marrow, you know, from the biopsy is being sent out to lab. Your PET scans still going through, but you know, you need to call the lymphoma center. I referred you to somebody because I don't do that. I do myeloma.
Actually,
So I call.
sorry, Jason, before we go into
Yeah.
that, I want to clarify. Was that, I know that cancer had already popped into your head when they talked about the bone marrow biopsy that first time, but was this the first time you heard someone basically definitively say, though, that?
Yeah. On the phone. On the phone, you know, it was literally on the phone with a doctor I didn't have a relationship with, the same one who said this isn't that I left the office, you know, because I didn't know I was getting a bone marrow. It was a hematologist that I was sent to do a rule out. You know, it all happened very fast and it was very shocking, and I had no idea. You know, I was very shocked. um, I would have never guessed that I had cancer.
And to find out in that way too, kind of like unceremoniously, just sort of like it slipped in a little as like a, well, hey, by the way, I looked at it and I know for sure this is what you have. And yet you have never even been told that you have cancer definitively. Like, I guess we don't really process in that moment anyway, but how did that hit you?
Hard. So like, you know, doing the rule out, I thought I was having to do all these horrible things just to like appease like the rule out. And I was still in the belief that like all these other doctors telling me, look, your blood work's perfect. I'm sure you're fine. You know, I had so many doctors tell me that, you know, from the dermatologist to the, you know, immunologist, allergist, my primary care, you know, so many people, you know, were like, oh, I'm sure it's probably just something immune, you know, autoimmune, you know, I'm sure it'll probably, you know. So in my mind, I just think, oh my God, I have to do these two horrible tests to like, you know, help figure this out. But like, I'm not thinking I have cancer. That wasn't what I was thinking at all. So when she said it couldn't have been more of a shock. I was completely in shock. And there wasn't a lot of conversation, after that. It was just like, I think I asked like one or two questions, and her responses were like, "I'm not a lymphoma doctor. You have to call the lymphoma center." So I got information that I had cancer, but then I didn't really have anybody to ask like follow-up questions to. And like and then there's a lot of B cell cancers. So I don't know what it is. Yeah, so
Did you go on Google?
so I did a little bit. My friend who was a doctor, I called him, and he's such a great friend. He came over immediately. He was to me like within an hour, and we were able to talk like, well, it could be, there's some ones that aren't that bad, like, we were going through the list. He was trying to talk me down a little bit. But you talked about the scan anxiety part. So when I called the lymphoma center, it was like, we're not seeing you until you have a lymph node removed. We're going to need one in order to formally diagnose this. And so that period was like 4.5, 5 weeks of like, from you have cancer to like, what is this? I had to like find a surgeon, schedule an appointment with a surgeon to meet before a surgery, then schedule a surgery. Then it goes out to a lab, and they couldn't have told me more times, like, it literally takes a week. It takes 5 full days. It's not going to come back any sooner. We assure you, like 5 days is the earliest. And then from there, then I have to get an appointment with the doctor to get the results. So it was like a good 4.5, 5 weeks of just like complete anxiety. Those were definitely the worst weeks, the not knowing of what my outlook is, what my prognosis is, what is going to happen in terms of treatment. Those were the worst, 4.5, 5 weeks.
I'm so glad, Jason, that you brought that up because, well, first of all, that is a really long time. I mean, probably one of the longest I've heard in terms of having to wait for all the diagnostics and the results to come back. But it's the not knowing exactly. It's at least if you know what you're dealing with, you can plan for it or feel like you have some, plan of action instead of being in limbo. I did want to. I don't know if this is true for other, hospitals and healthcare centers, but when I was diagnosed, our friend, my friend, who's also a doctor, just said, just go to the emergency room, just get yourself into the system. And then they have to do all the tests and you're like in the hospital as opposed to like doing this outpatient, which your experience sounds, I mean, just so terrible, really,
You
So,
know,
yeah.
the terrible part of it was a lot of it was, what the anxiety part that you sort of hinted at, like when you're waiting to get the scan results, that's what made it so terrible, like the meeting with the surgeon and, the appointments and, all of that wasn't a bad experience. It was, and I felt like I navigated it as fast as I could. Um, within the system. But you call to make a prelim appointment with a surgeon on a Monday. Okay, you get in on the next available might be Thursday. You meet Thursday, then you got to get on the surgery calendar. Oh, I only do surgeries. It could be 1 day or 2 days a week because they're meeting with so many people for pre-op and post-op. So these surgeons might just schedule surgeries 1 day a week, or 2 days max. So then you're getting on their schedule for the following week. Then you got a week for it to be in the lab, and then you got to get on your doctor's to meet. So I don't know. Like I understand the idea of like just check into the emergency room, but how much faster could it have been? Um, so I
Yeah.
don't know if that would have set it up for me.
Yeah, it's of course it's like it's very individual and it depends on where you go. For me, I had a B-cell lymphoma, and it ended up being about a little over a week where I went through the same thing. I had a bone marrow biopsy, I had a lymph node, excision biopsy done where they had to test it to figure all that stuff out. Scans, like a million scans, but um, yeah, I don't know. It did feel a little bit more expedited for sure, but um, but look, again, it's a very individual response. But so I do want to get a little bit forward here. After the excisional biopsy where they took a lymph node under your left armpit, um, can you describe the day that you got the result? I know at this point you already knew at least that you had cancer, but to find out what it was, like describe that moment.
Sure. So for me, the worst day was, getting a phone call from the hematologist saying you have, some B cell cancer. I don't know what it is. That was the worst day, I was crying and thinking this is it. And, that was definitely the worst day. Going in to get the formal diagnosis and meeting my doctor for the first time was a very long visit. I brought two friends with me. One of them who was my friend who was the doctor, which I'm very grateful for. And we were there for like a good 3 hours, 3.5 hours. And I had already, had a ton of questions, that I had, collected over the 3 and 4 weeks that I was waiting. And, you know, that wasn't as bad as just, because I was getting information, and my doctor, who's at Well Cornell, Dr. Ron, she said, you have mantle cell lymphoma, and she explained it. And I immediately felt very lucky because the hematologist had referred me to the lymphoma center at Well Cornell, and there's a handful of doctors there. And the one that I just randomly ended up being assigned to happens to be the one who specializes in mantle cell lymphoma. So that was kind of like, a miracle in a way, because it seems like, of the options there, because I didn't really pick, they just sort of, she referred me to somebody and I just accepted the referral. So that seemed magical. Like I got to the exact right doctor that I should be seeing.
That's awesome. Yeah, sometimes it's a good luck, and sometimes it's good. And so for you, you were diagnosed at 39. As you said, most patients are men who happen to be 60 or over 60. Um, and so when Dr. Ron was describing to you mantle cell lymphoma, the treatment options, what did she say, and how did you make that decision? We went over a little bit, but
So she said the traditional path to treat mantle cell would include R-CHOP chemotherapy, and then depending on the result, potentially be followed with a stem cell transplant. She said that she had another option for me, which was a clinical trial that she happened to be heading up for mantle cell lymphoma, which that also felt very, magical to me. Like, I landed with this doctor who specializes in it, and now she's also, heading up a phase 2 clinical trial. So she had presented both options, and I knew instantly, like, I wasn't going to do the R-CHOP chemotherapy because I told you I wasn't going to do what I saw my mom did, in that moment. And my friend who was a doctor, he was there with me, and we asked a lot of questions. He asked a lot of questions as well about the clinical trial. And she left the room, and I turned to him and I said, what do you think? And I just, wanted his opinion, but in my mind, I already knew I'm not doing that R-CHOP stuff, And he goes, I think you should do the traditional route. There's just more data. They've been using it more. That we know that it works. I think you should do the traditional route. And I said, I think I'm going to go the other way. She came back in, and I asked a lot more questions, and they presented me with like a stack of papers, like a contract, and I read through it all. And I think I sat there for like another hour, just contemplating, which ones to do. And then before I left, I signed all the paperwork for the clinical trial. And she said, all right, come back in a week from today and you start. So that's how I started.